Something is changing in Nigeria. And many people are pretending not to see it. But some people are now speaking. One of them is Pat Utomi. He said something very serious. He said the current political situation and control of government institutions is worse than during the time of Sani Abacha. That is not a small statement. That is a very heavy statement. Because when people talk about Abacha, they talk about fear, control, and power being held by a few people. They talk about a time when institutions were not independent and when power was concentrated in very few hands. So when someone like Pat Utomi compares the current situation to that period, many people believe it should not be ignored. He did not just talk about politics in general. He spoke about the executive branch and the way power is being used and controlled. He spoke about institutions that are supposed to be independent but are now being accused of taking sides. According to him, there is a deliberate plan to weaken political opponents, especially people like Peter Obi, and make sure some strong opposition figures do not even make it to the ballot. That is a very serious accusation in a democracy. Because democracy is supposed to be about competition. Different parties. Different candidates. Different ideas. Then the people decide. But if some candidates are removed before the election even starts, then the people are not really choosing anymore. The system is choosing for them. He also talked about Inec and how some recent decisions have raised serious questions about neutrality and independence. Many political observers have started to believe that the real political battle in Nigeria is no longer just between political parties. It is now about who controls the institutions. Because in modern politics, elections are not only won by popularity. They are also won by structure, institutions, legal battles, party control, and political strategy long before election day. If you control the party structure, you control who gets tickets. If you control institutions, you control decisions. If you control security pressure, you can weaken opponents. If you create internal crises in opposition parties, they become too busy fighting themselves to fight you. This is why many analysts are now saying that Nigerian politics is entering a very strategic and dangerous phase. Not dangerous because of violence, but dangerous because of silent political control. Silent control is more powerful than loud control. Because many people may not even notice what is happening until it is too late. You weaken one opposition party. You divide another one. You pull some leaders to your side. You pressure some leaders with investigations. You support factions inside parties. You delay some political processes. You speed up others. Before the election comes, the opposition is already weak, divided, and confused. Then the election becomes easier to win. This is why the statement by Pat Utomi is making many people uncomfortable. Because he is not a small political figure. He is known as a political economist and public intellectual who has watched Nigerian politics for many years. When people like him start using strong words, it usually means they believe something serious is happening behind the scenes. He also warned that if citizens do not pay attention and defend democratic institutions, Nigeria could slowly move toward a situation where elections exist but real political competition becomes very weak. And when opposition becomes weak, democracy also becomes weak. Because democracy is not just about the ruling party. Democracy is about strong opposition, strong institutions, and public trust in the system. If people start believing that the system is already controlled before elections happen, then trust in democracy begins to disappear. And once trust disappears, the political system becomes very unstable, even if elections are still being held. This is why the conversation in Nigeria is slowly changing. It is no longer just about who will win the next election. The conversation is now about something bigger. Who controls the system before the election even begins? Now something very unusual is happening in Nigerian politics. Groups that normally oppose each other are beginning to speak the same language. Groups that campaigned against each other are now talking about cooperation. Groups that once blamed each other for Nigeria's problems are now saying the problem is bigger than all of them. This is not a normal political development. This is not something that happens when the political environment is calm. This usually happens when different groups believe there is a bigger threat that affects all of them. Youth groups connected to supporters of Atiku Abubakar. Supporters of Peter Obi. Supporters linked to Nasir El-Rufai. Supporters connected to Rotimi Amici. And supporters of Rabiu Kwankwaso are now gathering under one political umbrella through the ADC coalition. These are political camps that have disagreed for many years. They have different ideologies, different regions, different structures, and different ambitions. But now, youth movements from these groups are saying the same thing. They believe Nigeria's democracy is under threat. They believe opposition parties are being weakened slowly. They believe political pressure is increasing on opposition leaders. They believe party crises are not just internal problems but part of a wider political struggle. According to statements released by coalition youth groups, they are seeing a pattern. They believe this pattern includes legal battles, leadership disputes, arrests, investigations, and political pressure appearing mostly around opposition figures. Whether all these claims are fully accurate or not, what is important is that many political actors now believe the political environment is changing in a serious way. In politics, perception is very powerful. If many political groups believe the system is no longer neutral, they begin to act differently. They stop fighting each other and start looking at the bigger opponent. They start forming alliances. They start planning long before elections. They start building coalitions instead of individual campaigns. That is what is beginning to happen now. Political analysts are now saying that the 2027 election may not be a normal party versus party election. It may become coalition versus ruling party. And coalition politics is very different from normal elections. Coalitions bring numbers together. They bring structures together. They bring regional support together. They reduce vote splitting. They make elections more competitive. But coalitions are also very difficult to manage. Because every leader has ambition. Every party wants control. Every group wants influence. And managing all these interests is not easy. That is why many coalitions fail before elections even happen. Internal disagreements destroy them. Leadership struggles weaken them. Trust issues break them apart. But when coalitions survive, they become very powerful political machines. The youth groups involved in this new movement are also making strong public statements. They are saying this is no longer about one candidate or one political party. They are saying this is about protecting multi-party democracy in Nigeria. That is a very strong political message. Because once politics becomes about saving democracy instead of winning elections, the conversation changes completely. It becomes emotional. It becomes ideological. It becomes a national conversation, not just a party conversation. They are also accusing some state institutions of being used to weaken opposition parties through internal crises and leadership disputes. They believe some party conflicts are being influenced from outside in order to destabilize opposition structures before future elections. Again, these are political accusations, but the fact that multiple groups are now repeating the same concerns shows that trust between political actors and institutions is becoming weaker. And when political trust becomes weak, politics becomes more aggressive, more strategic, and more unpredictable. Right now, Nigeria is slowly entering a period where alliances, mergers, defections, and political negotiations will become more frequent. More politicians may leave their parties. More parties may merge. More coalitions may appear. More political meetings will happen behind closed doors. More public statements will be made. More accusations will fly across parties. This is usually the period before a major political realignment. A political realignment is when the political map changes. New alliances form. Old alliances break. New power blocks emerge. New political strategies appear. This period is usually very quiet at the beginning, but very loud later. Right now, Nigeria appears to be at the beginning of that period. And many political observers believe that what is happening now may shape the 2027 election more than the campaigns that will happen in 2026 or 2027. Because in politics, elections are not won only during campaigns. Most elections are decided by structures, alliances, and strategy long before the campaign even starts. And that is why many political groups are no longer waiting. They are already moving. The protest call that is now being discussed across political circles is not an ordinary protest. It is not a one-day protest. It is not a symbolic protest. It is being described as an indefinite nationwide protest called #Occupy Inec. Indefinite means it does not end until demands are met. That alone changes the meaning of the protest completely. The coalition of ADC youths announced that the protest would continue across states and the Federal Capital Territory until their demands are addressed. This immediately moved the situation from normal political complaints to organized political resistance. Their first major demand is the resignation of the Inec chairman. They accused the electoral body of losing public trust and failing to remain neutral in political matters. This is a very serious demand because Inec is the institution responsible for elections in Nigeria. Once trust in the electoral body becomes a national political issue, the entire political system becomes tense. Their second demand is an end to what they described as political persecution and harassment of opposition leaders. They specifically mentioned figures like Nasir El-Rufai and Abubakar Malami, saying opposition figures are being targeted because of their political positions. Their third demand is the protection of opposition parties and Nigeria's multi-party system. They said Nigeria must not move toward a system where only one political party becomes dominant while others are weakened or divided. Their fourth demand is that the leadership of the ADC must be respected and not interfered with from outside political forces. When you look at these demands carefully, you will notice something important. These demands are not about fuel price. They are not about electricity. They are not about salaries or inflation. These demands are about power. Political power. Institutional power. Electoral power. Opposition survival. Democracy itself. That is why many political observers are watching this situation very closely. Because protests about the economy are common in many countries. But protests about the structure of democracy itself are very different. They usually mean political tension is rising at a higher level. The coalition also called on youth movements across the country to mobilize and join the protest movement, saying this is not about one political party but about the future of Nigeria's democracy. That message is very strategic. Once a political movement frames its struggle as a national democratic struggle instead of a party struggle, it becomes bigger and more difficult to ignore. It also becomes more dangerous politically because it can attract support from people who are not even members of the party. At the center of all these political developments is the government led by Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Supporters of the government argue that the government is simply enforcing the law, managing political institutions, and dealing with party conflicts as they arise. They argue that opposition parties often create their own internal crises and then blame the government for their problems. But critics of the government believe something else. They believe the political environment is being carefully managed to weaken opposition structures before the next general election cycle becomes fully active. This disagreement between government supporters and opposition groups is now creating a very tense political atmosphere. And when politics becomes tense this early before an election cycle, it usually means the election season will be very intense. Political realignments may increase. More politicians may defect from one party to another. More alliances may be formed quietly. More legal battles may appear. More party leadership disputes may happen. More accusations and counter-accusations will continue in the media. Nigeria may be entering a long political season that will not end until the next general elections. But the most important part of this entire situation is not the protests, not the statements, and not the accusations. The most important part is public trust. If the public trusts the electoral system, the courts, and political institutions, then democracy remains stable even when politicians fight. But if the public stops trusting institutions, then every political decision becomes controversial, every election result becomes disputed, and every political action becomes suspicious. Democracy does not collapse in one day. It weakens slowly when trust disappears slowly. Right now, Nigeria is not in an election year yet. Campaigns have not officially started. Parties have not conducted primaries. Candidates have not been officially selected. Yet political tension is already rising. Coalitions are already forming. Accusations are already flying. Protests are already being planned. Political groups are already preparing for a long struggle. That tells you something very important. The real political battle for the future of Nigeria may not start in 2027. It may have already started.